Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of with Lionel. I mean, I just, it's a very despairing thing for somebody who believes in free discourse to say. But, I have sort of slightly sad personal experience of this in some ways because my daughter, who's now 25, went to university, quite a good university, Leeds, and I was, very excited that she would come out with this amazing critical mind and open thinking, and I was so depressed when she came back. It's just her mind had closed completely, and she had no concept whatsoever that there might be anything out. I mean, perhaps this has been true of students forever, I don't know, but I mean, I found it very depressing. That there was all the channels of communication had closed down, and it was just, maybe it was a father-daughter thing. I don't know, but I don't think so. And I found it terrifying. And if that's what universities are doing to people, then I ain't paying the tuition fees anymore. That's for sure.
So we'll take some questions from people in the audience. Very fast hand to go up. And say your name just before you say your question.
My name's Joe. My first question is, oh, sorry, sit down.
Do you want to ask Tim or Lionel to do that? Yeah, Tim, can you turn the aircon off?
No, my question's for Lionel, actually. I didn't realise she was such a advocate of being against cultural appropriation, but something that I've been thinking about recently with...
That's a complicated formulation. The weird thing about cultural appropriation is if you're against it, then it sounds as if you don't think you should be able to borrow from other people's cultures. It becomes grammatically weird, and because I get grilled on this all the time, I know how grammatically weird it is. It's a dumb concept. So I don't advocate even using the expression, much less do I, I've sometimes said I advocate cultural appropriation. Well, that's stupid too, because I don't like the expression. I think it's inaccurate. I think, it's there. You don't steal from someone when you make up a character. You don't. It's your character. So that I just wanted to clarify that is awkward.
My question is actually about the phrase cultural appropriation, because I think that, I'm getting on dangerous territory here talking about race, but it seems like it's not so much cultural appropriation as racial appropriation. Nobody minds when Jamie Oliver opens a chain of Italian restaurants because that's a white
They
man
do.
from white culture, or when he does jerk rice because that's the Caribbean culture and he's a different race. The same with Apu from The Simpsons is voiced by a white guy, which is a problem. But Groundskeeper Willie is voiced by an American, which is arguably a different culture to the Scots. Nobody sees a problem with that because you can borrow. It seems like you can borrow freely in everybody's mind from a culture that is predominantly of people of the same race as yourself. But as soon as you cross that line, it seems like then that's when cultural appropriation, or as I would say, it's more racial appropriation, becomes a problem in people's minds. And I wonder, I mean, maybe there's a justification for that I'm not aware of because I haven't, I find it hard to find people in my friendship group. Maybe there's someone here that could offer a justification for that, but in my head I can't see one myself personally. I wondered if you thought of that, or if you had any thoughts on that.
So I'm just going to repeat part of the question for the viewers on the live stream. And John, your point was... Joe, your point was that there seems to be a difference between cultural appropriation and racial appropriation. Racial appropriation is what seems to really create a big reaction. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I mean that's basically the only thing that creates a reaction. It's only when you borrow from cultures that's different racially from yours that people seem to be offended or have a problem.
I actually think that's pretty well observed. It does seem to be much more about race than anything else. After all, when men dress up as women or women dress up as men, we're supposed to think that's great. I guess that's a kind of gender cultural appropriation, right? So it is quite specific to race. The trouble is, if we're going to if we're going to establish this idea that you own your racial culture, let's call it for what it is, your racial culture. First off, of course, we have the problem of mixed race people. I mean, what do they own? Where do they belong? What is theirs? And furthermore, if you own your racial culture, then why can't I turn around and say, well, then black people can't use an iPhone, right? Invented by white people. You can't play Beethoven. You know, you can't read Dickens. It's mine. It belongs to me. It's white people's culture. Now, turn that around, I hope you can hear how utterly absurd that sounds. And also ungenerous, ugly. You know, I don't want to own my culture. And you know what? I didn't invent my culture. It doesn't belong to me because I just inherited it. I didn't earn it. You know, it came to me. And I will try to honor it by reading Dickens, you know, or listening to Beethoven, or using my iPhone. But I don't want to limit myself to that culture because it isn't supposed to be a prison. And in fact, my culture belongs to everyone. And there is no such thing as one culture and another culture. They blend all together. The borders are completely fluid. That's the way it ought to be. And one of the reasons that major cities around the world are such dynamic places to be is that those cultures are furiously interacting. So we do not thrive even economically by putting a fence around ourselves and protecting our intellectual, cultural, artistic property. None of this stuff belongs to us. It's all borrowed. We came into it, and we're going to have to give it up when we leave. So I think that we need to encourage a sense of generosity. You know, I have some problems with the whole concept of multiculturalism just because it comes with mass migration, which I don't want to get into that. But it's associated with mass migration in a way that hasn't always had a positive impact. But at core, the concept of multiculturalism is sound. That is, it's this big interaction. We run into each other. We share ideas. We share the things we make. And we're, both of us, you know, we're all enriched as a consequence. And that's what's so utterly wrong-headed about this cultural appropriation nonsense. And I honestly do believe, you know, whether or not we get our upcoming catastrophe that cures us of all ills, this is an example of something that is not going to survive and will later be held up as an example of the ludicrous excesses of our era.
So, firstly, I think it is unlike we're talking about how the whole idea of the war on art might be a bit of a fringe activity. The obsession of a small group of sociology students and people in academia, and I think we rejected that idea that it was much more serious than that. Cultural appropriation, on the other hand, I think genuinely is quite a fringe issue. I don't think anybody really worries that much about it, except quite a small number of people in the universities. Having said that, I think there was a time when it was quite a valid concept. And when I think of Elvis Presley coming along and, you know, taking basically black music and making a fortune out of it, while all the people who were Chuck Berry and so forth were just scrapping along on pennies because all the white record executives were just taking their money, and the same with bluesmen, you know, ripping them off and leaving them with...
Isn't that an economic injustice rather than an evil stealing problem, that he didn't give enough credit to the people who actually wrote these songs, and he also did not pay enough money economic arrangements were unfair and deeply unjust. It's a different, I'm familiar with that argument. My husband is a musician, and he always hated Elvis Presley because of this. But I don't think it's exactly the same issue.
No, I take your point. I just think that firstly, I can speak louder than you because I have the mic, which I think is and that has to be taken into account. And also, I think it's in some ways a fine point because the people, the fact is the white people had the economic power in the 1950s, and they had the means of production, if you like, and they had the means of dissemination. And black people didn't have that possibility. And, it is quite hard to resist the feeling they were ripped off, big time.
Ripped off.
And you can call that an economic argument if you like, but you could also call it a cultural argument. You could also call it a matter of cultural appropriation. But I think those times have really passed, and I think now the idea of since world music has come and the whole idea of us borrowing from other cultures universally is pretty widely accepted as a positive thing. I think it's quite a small group of people, I would think, who actually oppose it. I mean, I could be wrong.
I just want to note the fact that during the break, I was talking to somebody who is in a literary agency and is constantly having to deal with this whole cultural appropriation all the time. So it seems to me that maybe it's not as small and confined to a tiny group as you may think. I'll put you in touch.
So we'll take a question there.
Hi.
Yep.
Hi. I'm sure, like everybody. Charlie Brown.
Seriously. I must have made your day.
We love being offended, which actually basically goes on what I was going to say. I mean, like everyone, most of us here, I'm sure, we follow these sort of stories and issues all the time, and I range from going, oh, interesting, to get me off this well, I want to get on. But what I struggle with is trying to work out whether is it to be filed under "'twas ever thus." And Tim mentioned about the nature of human psychology. You could talk about evolutionary psychology, that we need, as a tribe, whatever our tribe is, we need another. We need to have a heretic. We've always had to burn witches. We've always had to have that to be unified. But on the other hand, at times in history there's been explosions, cultural revolutions, when it's just gone wild. And I thought about this today. I was reading about Anthony Lennon, the theatre director who has received lots of funding as a black person of colour,
Oh,
and
yeah.
is in fact actually white Irish.
Right.
And obviously maybe he's from the land of Dolezal and hail all of that. But it's not that story that caught my eye. It was the fact that someone was commenting about it, and they said about the news story that a white person cannot write about it. That's a given in certain quarters. But they said even a black person should not write about his story. And the person that was commenting said it should be someone racially ambiguous to write about the stories. And I read this and I thought, my God, now we're getting into Nazi territory. The blood defines the eligibility, it's pseudo-genetics. And that
It's
made me think,
racist.
yeah, and
It's
that's what made-
racist.
yeah, and that's what made me think. The question is this "'twas ever thus," or are we in Salem? Are we in the mad time of cultural revolution?
So Charlie Brown's question is this a unique time, or is this just, it always feels like this, that there are always these taboos in our culture, it's just that they've sort of shifted into different places? Is this a particular Salem witch trial kind of moment?
Well, I think we are obviously dealing with the results of secularism, of which I am a big proponent, but I'm afraid that we're, the group we're talking about is in the grip of a kind of evangelical fervor. And, to be fair, we're dealing with mostly younger people who are thirsty for purpose and faith, and a reason to be in the world, a guiding principle to tell them what to do. I mean, I am profoundly secular, and therefore I don't tend to subscribe to a catechism of any kind. And my general answer to that thirst is, well, I think you're on an individual journey, and that to subscribe to a catechism is a shortcut that cheats you. But it is very seductive. And, religion offers a lot of things. It offers community, and this particular religion also offers an enemy. And, far be it from me to decry people's eagerness to believe in something, but my biggest problem with this identity politics movement is that it is too negative. It is too fired by, if you will, a word I read 50 to 100 times a day, hatred. Okay? It has too much of a need to demonize. It is a very predatory movement, and it thrives on taking people down. And I don't like the generational element either. It's become young people versus old people in a creepy way. I grew up with some of that stuff, that old don't trust people under 30 nonsense, and we got over it. Actually, that's interestingly misremembered. That's someone over 30 remembering that phrase. I don't like the hostility. I don't like the venom and the need for anger and righteous indignation. It is Tim may talk about how we're all awful, and sure we are, but some of us are more awful than others. And this religious movement is capable of bringing out elements that might otherwise be ameliorated if the ideology were otherwise. But I really don't like this viciousness, and you see it on Twitter all the time. And it's the people who are the most vicious who get the most attention. And it's one of the reasons I'm not on Twitter. Because why would I want to paint a bullseye on my forehead? But as a religion, I find it wanting. And the other thing that it's wanting is that it's calling people to embrace their own weakness. It's become totally trite to talk about the exaltation of victimhood. So that's taken as a given. But it means that you incentivize people to identify with their own degradation, their own oppression, and to embrace that oppression, lest they become powerlessness. It's become this weird flipped thing, so that the most people who have the most oppression are the most exalted. And I just don't think that's the answer. That has not been the answer in my life. For example, the only thing I might cling to on the victimhood front is being female, and it has not, that has not made my life being treated like shit because I'm a woman and being underestimated because of a woman. I'm a woman. It's been, I want to be remembered for my books and maybe for events like this one, but not because my father never expected me to become very important. I got over that.
So, yeah, it's interesting it's taken sort of this long before the word religion has kind of been brought up, because it's a very interesting part of this kind of this ideology, that it does seem very religious in tone. And I know you mentioned something like that when we did our interview a few months ago.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier this evening as well. But I mean, and the question. No, well, that's it's mutual. The gentleman mentioned Salem, of course, which is a witch trial conducted by the church. And Arthur Miller wrote, of course, The Crucible, based on the Salem witch trials, which is a kind of... And he wrote it obviously as a rejoinder to what was happening in McCarthyism in America at the time. And it's all... Really, there's two kinds of religion. There's the declared religions and the undeclared religions. Secularism is another kind of undeclared religion in some ways. And certainly the social justice warriors and the radical left have always been a kind of undeclared religion, whether it's Mao or Stalin or Marx or Hitler. You know, Nietzsche pointed out in the 19th century that once God died, that you know, what was going to rise up to fill the void was more terrible than religion ever came up with, and that was true. It was religion without God, and that's still what we're seeing. We're seeing people scrabbling around to find faith in something. Only they don't call it faith; they call it justice. They call it equity. They call it identity. But it's religion. It's quite simply a religion. It's a religion because, and that's why, as Lionel said, when you're trying to debate with these people, you won't get any further than debating with the Reverend Ian Paisley. You know, because you're debating with people who've already made up their mind. You know, and I've spent all my life not making up my mind. Why the hell can't other people? You know, I mean, it's just, you know, why are people so arrogant as to think they know what the hell's going on? Nobody knows what the hell's going on. Certainly not me. You know, and these people swaggering around, going about how they know this is right and this is wrong and this is right and this is wrong. Well, fuck off.
So Bianca had her hand up earlier.
Tim spoke earlier about representation of black characters on TV, used to all be criminals, you know, that kind of thing, and we moved past it, but there's still a big debate in the television industry about representation on screen. And so, for example, Sky has a target they give their production companies to have 20% of lead roles from a BAME background. I'm just really interested to know what the panel thinks about that kind of approach within our television industry.
So Bianca's question is about quotas within the TV industry, for example, 20% of all leading roles going to BAME characters, for example.
Well, it troubles me. I can sort of see the principle that one should try and make the figures stack up, though they seem to be going quite a long way beyond stacking up as far as I can make out. But I mean, you know, if there are 12% ethnic minorities in the country, then in a fair society there would be 12% of mainstream actors. I think it's way beyond that actually now. But I mean, and it seems to be a sort of kind of counter-reaction to the idea of the domination of white and majority culture for so many years. So I can see that argument. What worries me, I suppose, is that it's replacing something ineffable and unquantifiable with something quantifiable and measurable. And art isn't quantifiable and measurable. The trouble is, in other words, it's threatening quality. And who can say what quality is? I don't know what quality is. I know it when I see it, but I don't know what it is. And there was once a culture at, say, the BBC, where there was a kind of a group of producers, often mavericks, and you know, some of them were mavericks, some of them weren't, but there was a bunch of interesting people who had the license to just go, that's an interesting piece of work. we should run that, you know, because it's an interesting piece of work. Now, you can't defend what an interesting piece of work is. It's like saying, you know, prove to me that Picasso was a great artist. I mean, I can't prove it to you. Whereas if I can say, you know, how's the BAME representation going? So, well, I could show you statistics on that, you know, and that's becomes measurable, and it's enormously comforting to people of a bureaucratic mindset to have something measurable. So that's my more general and high-minded reason for opposing it. The other one is that when they were out trying to sell the screenplay of my new novel, it's like, we're not interested in anybody who is a white middle-aged man. No one wants to look at it. They're interested in BAME writers. They're interested in women. But if you think you're going to get your book, you know, adapted, it's just not going to happen. Now, that's my selfish reason. It's like, that seems a bit unfair. Could be a shit book. I don't know. But then, and it could be expression. But the idea that putting myself aside, and not something I like to do. But if I did momentarily, before we come back to me again, I would really worry that this idea of this very intangible idea of, that is lodged in a culture, impossible to quantify, that there's a kind of, and it's very elitist. That's the problem. It's very elitist because it relies on certain people with what we also can't quantify, called taste, you know, and artistic sensitivity and cultural insight. Can't measure any of these things. You know, it's just once upon a time people take a crack at it just because it was interesting. And now we're in a place where we could, you know, it's part of the box ticking culture where we can say, you know, well, was that series any good? Who cares whether it was any good, you know? It had the following characteristics, and I can, you know, why are you asking me if it's any good? I mean, that's not the point, is it? You know, yeah, it is the fucking point.
So I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So I think you had your hand up before. Sorry.
Sure. So, I mean, thank you for this. It's been really interesting, and I agree with a lot of what you say. I agree we need nuance, we need truth, all of that, and we need complexity and openness. But I think the concern I have is sometimes we're talking about this, we're ignoring the real dangers that there are in the world right now. For example, when you talk about arts, you're both artists that come to it from a place of good faith. You're here, you're trying to write and to create art in a way that's getting to a greater truth. But there are people who use art in a very different way. And one example of that, obviously, is you know, the thing we've just seen about Grenfell. That's arguably a piece of art which is done in order to incite hatred. And that's something that we're seeing, it's growing, and it's dangerous. And if you come from a background that... Because it creates hatred, and we've seen in the past...
Okay, I think this is very...
Okay, fine.
No, I'm interested. Why do you think that's dangerous? Why is that dangerous?
Okay, if you come from a community which is going to be the subject of hate because it helps repel someone else, in Trump's case, for example, a populist, you can become demonized. And we know in other countries what happens when you demonize people. If you look at Rwanda, the use of demonizing certain groups was used to strengthen other groups, and that ultimately led to violence. That's the lesson of history. So I mean, for me, seeing that kind of thing happen without recognizing the dangers inherent in that is problematic.
Okay, let me just get this straight. You don't think that burning a paper representation of a building is going to lead to our macheteing each other in the streets?
With respect, I'm speaking to you with respect, and I'm listening to everything you're saying. I believe in a lot of what you're saying, but you know that it's not as simple as that, right? You know that you start off by mocking people, by making them less, by making them the target of hate in some way. And yeah, burning a piece of art is a way of minimizing them, of making them it demonstrates them being less than other parts of the community. It's an easy way of transferring distracting people from what you're doing by demonizing this other group. And that,
an art can be used in that way, and you can laugh at that. You can laugh, right? But art, that's the problem, though, isn't it? Isn't? Yeah, but that's your perception. But that's your perception. That's your perception.
All right, I'm going to go out on a limb here, unusually. I found that case very interesting. Now, it isn't really a piece of art, but let's say it was. You know, let's call it a piece of art. I mean, maybe they think of it as art. It's an arbitrary category. The question is whether or not those, I think it was mostly kids, wasn't it? With some adults too? Okay. All right. I don't even care who did it. Interestingly, the cops are unable to pin any crime on these people. It's not a hate crime because that disaster did not belong to one of those specific protected categories of people. So it's an interesting case. Now look, I am the first person to admit that it was an excruciatingly poor taste, but I think it should be legal. I don't think those people should be in jail. And we could call it a piece of art. We could call it just an act of demonstrating how thick and crass you are. But it's not illegal to be thick. God, most of Britain would be in jail. And it's not illegal to be crass. It's not, believe it or not, illegal to be racist. And I think that's one of the things we have to get our heads around. Because, you know, we all have prejudices. We all approach each other with little categories in our minds and little preconceived notions. Sometimes they're too positive. Oh, you know, the Asian over there, he's so good at math. And that's a kind of prejudice. But prejudice is not against the law. And I think we are losing a distinction between social decency, which we would all like each other to display, and therefore social indecency, and criminality. And it's not the place of the state to enforce social decency. We all have a right to have an opinion about these people who put together that model and thought it was so hilarious. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't decry it. It was not funny. It was a very poor joke. It was ugly. So I'm not defending it, but I don't want them arrested.
They burnt Theresa May and Boris Johnson as well.
Sorry.
They burnt Theresa May in effigy of Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
Which they should be able to do also.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, it's a really good question, I think, and it goes to the heart of a lot of things that make me uneasy. And I don't think it's simple, because one can remember back to the 30s and Der Stürmer and the Nazi press, who were publishing articles that vilified Jews. Though this burning down Grenfell is not the same thing, but it's part of the spectrum of the argument that if one allows hate out there, it's going to have some terrible consequences. And it's always a question of balancing these rights. I have to say I'm 100% behind Lionel in the idea that this is you know, vile and pathetic. But when I heard that 6 people had been arrested over it, it really sent chills up my spine. I mean, for fuck's sake. You know, this is you can't have the police going around some stupid guy who's, I don't know. I mean, it's also part of the what you might call the shift in the definition of hurt. You know, and I'm sure if I had a relative at Grenfell who died at Grenfell, I'd be extremely hurt by what they had done and offended and upset. But I just can't live with that definition of hurt. I can't live with it. I don't think we can live with it as a society. because once we go down that road of psychological hurt amounting to a crime, I just don't see where that ends, you know. And I just think you're on a terrifying road. I mean, I really sympathise with anyone who lost someone in that building to having to watch that. But as Lionel says, there are crude, stupid, and wicked people out there, and we can't lock them all up. And that whole, you know, I mean, if they were, you know, and it's not an easy answer. I mean, there was that story about Count Dankula and his dog that did the Nazi salute, and you know, I don't know. There was something about that that made me uneasy as well. I don't mean uneasy because he was arrested. I mean, I was definitely uneasy about that, but I was also very uneasy about what he was doing. Not so much teaching a dog a Nazi salute, but it was what he said. He said, "Gas the Jews," and it was like there was something about that phrase that I found. Yeah, but it's not. It wasn't even "I hate the Jews." It was "gas the Jews." You know, it seems such an extreme. It doesn't sit. No, I'm sure, but I'm sure it's better than "gas the Jews" somehow. You know. But do you think it should? Do you think it should be illegal? Do you think he should have been? Do you think he should have been arrested? Nazi dogs. Yeah. Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, keep an eye on him. Yeah, I mean, the trouble is you do have to put up with a lot of, as Lionel said, a lot of assholes in the world, you know, and you can't lock them all up. And I think once you start locking them, and also there's always the problem of who's an asshole, you know, who defines an asshole, you know, and once you've got, you know, at the moment we've got a political climate that is quite stringently, I would say, you know, left wing in terms of social positioning. But if you switched that and it was the right wing who were defining what was acceptable and what wasn't, I think you would be, you know, in dangerous ground. If you had someone like Donald Trump, you know, who's America is protected by free speech laws, which we're not, saying, you know, well, I find it offensive that you present these left wing opinions against abortion, for instance, or in favour of abortion, and I want to suppress that view because I consider it to be wrong and immoral and in favour of murdering people, even though they're very small, you know, incipient people. Who's doing the defining, you know? And I think that's the real danger. But I take your point completely, and I it's a horrible thing. But between justice and the law, there's quite a big gap, I think. But thank you for the question.
So we are at 9:45, so I think we're going to have to end the Q&A here. But there's a lot of energy in the room, and I think we definitely should do more of these events. So I'm going to finish by saying thank you very much to Lionel Shriver. And also to, it's Tim, isn't it? And to Tim. And we have another event here in exactly 2 weeks' time, which is with Ian McGilchrist, the writer of The Master and His Emissary, and that will also be live streamed if we can get it working. Is it working now? Great, and goodbye to everyone on the live stream. Turn around and wave goodbye to everyone on the live stream. Thank you very much for coming. It's been great. Thank you.